Which was great. We're going to get that about started. Hi. How are you, Robert?
Good to meet you. I should listen to this.
Oh, okay. If you head down the hallway.
Okay.
It's green up there on top. Yeah. Until it hits green.
What do you think? This will get me through that little clicker will. Can I extend?
Hi everyone. I want to get your attention. My name is Roshni Melia, and I work here at Philanthropy New York. I want to thank you all for coming to this really exciting program. Got a ton of people here, which is really exciting. This program is particularly exciting for us because it's the first of its kind in terms of the content and also the fact that the format. Yes, we've done panels before, but after the panel, we're going to be doing this really cool arcade in the breakout space and the small conference room. So we welcome you to join us to actually play the games we're going to be talking about today. So we're really excited to be doing this program with media impact funders, Aim for Change, Zynga.org, iCivics, and WNET, and of course the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've all been active partners in putting this together, and we're really excited about it. So I'm going to turn it over to Vince Stehle, who is the Executive Director of the Media Impact Funders, and he is going to be moderating this panel. So let's give it up for him.
Thank you, everyone, here in the room and also on the live stream. We have a live stream audience. So thank you for joining us wherever you are, but especially for those of you in the room. I think you're going to have a special treat, not only in being able to confer and discuss with our panelists today, but also afterwards to actually engage with some of the games that we're going to be talking about, as Roshni said. So at Media Impact Funders, this is a particularly interesting topic for us. It's an area of funding which is a growing area. In the general category of media funding, we've seen great growth recently, but particularly in new media, interactive games, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. I just want to give a few framing comments for you, and also a little bit of the logistics of how we're going to do our event today. At Media Impact Funders, we've recently relaunched our website, and we'd invite you to go to mediaimpactfunders.org to see that. Among the hopefully interesting topics you'll find there is a special section on assessing the impact of media. It's our middle name, and we really take it seriously, and we try to pay attention to that. We're going to hear a lot about the impact of gaming today, but there's a special section there that is curated by my colleague Jessica Clark, who's here in the room with us, and you'll be seeing her tweeting from Media Impact Funders and also the Beyond Broadcaster personal Twitter handle. We're actually going to be doing another event next week in Los Angeles at the Annenberg Space for photography, so a cheap ploy to flack that event here. You can, if you can't make it to LA, that will also be on the live stream, where we'll be talking about really important work in advancing the impact discussion, but also introducing a really interesting new topic for us, which is documentary photography. And in particular, the work of the Open Society Foundation has been very strong in that area. Amy Yankin is here from Open Society. She's going to be leading some of that discussion as well. So this is, an ongoing sort of set of meetings and discussions that we have, but this particular one today is really focusing on the interactive gaming kind of activities that cover so many different topics. I would just point out that if you go to our website and you find the Media Grants Knowledge Center, you'll see one particular feature is a data mapping resource, which was created by the Foundation Center, our friends who are just downstairs here in this building. They've created a really powerful tool that you can use to track who's funding what and where. So we really encourage you to check that out. But what we found in a related report that we co-published a few months ago was that for the most recent years of data, 2009 through 2011, we saw media grant making rise by 21% in a time frame when general grant making was sort of on the slow rebound of 5.8% overall. So there's more funding for media overall. But what we also found was that in new media and in interactive gaming in that same time frame, the numbers doubled. So what I think you'll see there is, these are not enormous numbers in the absolute terms, but the trend line is very sharp and steep. So it's an exciting time. The resources are there and they're growing. And I think the other thing to say about that as it relates to interactive gaming versus traditional media, that what we're finding is for the general grant-making community, I think you can look in and see that actually it's a much more diverse field of activity. That the sort of typical way of thinking about media grants as documentary film or journalism or public media, while all still strong and growing, are also being joined by these new categories of interactive gaming and mobile platforms and all sorts of things. So it's a more diverse field. And then also for media funders who are in the game, I think the exciting thing is to understand that all of these new activities are not new, different, and totally separate from what you're doing, but they actually interact with what you're already supporting. And I think we see that from a really stellar panel that we've assembled here today, if I may say so myself. You can't always get who you want to on a panel, and I will acknowledge that we had tried to get Super Mario on this, but he was not available, and so we did the next best thing and got all of the best mortal human people to participate with us today in a variety of categories. And so leading our discussion today is going to be Burak, who's the president of Games for Change and executive producer of Half the Sky, which is one of the really powerful games projects out there with 1 million registered players. Before Games for Change, he was a co-founder at Impact Games, the internationally acclaimed Peacemaker and Play the Games platforms came from Impact Games. And Asi, in addition to his comments, is going to be after our discussion. He and his team are going to be demonstrating several of their games, including Half the Sky and several other projects in our little arcade just outside. Then immediately after that, Jeff Curley, who's the co-founder of the founder and executive director of iCivics, is going to be discussing his work, where at iCivics, Jeff had really saw this opportunity to dramatically improve the quality of civic education across the country, and he's got a very influential board leadership. His board chair is former Justice Sandra O'Connor, and they're making great strides in their work with 50,000 teachers and more than 3 million students using their products. After that, Sandra Sheppard is going to be talking about her work at WNET, one of the leading public broadcasting organizations in the country. In particular, she serves as executive producer of Cyber Chase, one of their popular programs and products. And she's going to talk about how, among other things, you're developing within the broadcast environment, you're developing interactive gaming activities that are both related to broadcast and also standalone, which is kind of interesting in that context. She's also going to be leading, actually Jeff and Sandra will both be sharing their games in the small conference room next door after our discussion. And then, we're also going to be hearing from one of the most influential funders in this category, Robert Torres, who was himself a very significant player in the space before he moved over to the Gates Foundation. Before that, he was, I think, one of the co-founders of Institute of Play and has a long history in education. But also, I would just circle back to the point that he was, before all that, a documentary filmmaker, and where his, was it 20 years ago, roughly, Robert was the writer and director of New York in Dreams, which premiered at Sundance and appeared on HBO. So all of these things sort of come together. And then our final presenter today is going to be Ken Weber, who is the executive director of Zynga.org, which is an independent nonprofit leading in the gaming space, and also associated, I think, affiliated with Zynga.com, the ubiquitous and exciting games company. And in addition to his role there, he's also chair of Games for Change, which brings us back to the beginning of the panel. But also, I would just note that he was chief operating officer at the One campaign before Zynga, and even before that, he was chief operating officer of Network for Good, and one of the really early shaping leaders of that organization, which just crossed the line last week, I think, of delivering over $1 billion of financial support from individuals to nonprofit organizations. So congratulations, Ken, in your contribution to that early organization's early work, which has just resulted in that great success. So that's the range of our program today, and we want all of you to tweet within the room at PNY event, and also anyone on the live stream. Let us know you're out there. Tweet to us, question us. We'll keep an eye on the tweet stream to see if you've got questions and comments from outside the room. And at this point, I want to turn it over to Asi.
Thank you. Okay, cool.
We can hear you.
That's good. So I want to first, before I begin, thank Vince and Media Impact Funders for putting this together. It was all his initiative, and Roshni from Philanthropy New York for making it happen from vision to reality, but also hosting us in this great space that allows us also to do those mini arcade activities and demos after the panel. What Vince asked me to do is to speak shortly to frame the sector and what are games for change, what are games for social change and learning. And I'm going to speak to the slides over there. And before I do that, I'll ask you who in the room is playing games? Who is playing games every week? Not bad at all. So I think we have 25%. That's a good audience. But you know, we have the majority that is not playing games frequently here, but still you came. So there is an interest and there is an engagement, and we're asking the question, why should we even care, right? So the first series of answers that I'm going to put on the board are those answers that have to do with the sheer size and growing power of video games as entertainment and as a medium. $66 billion global industry, surpassed both music and film industries. In many countries, you can even say that games are bigger than music and films combined. So the number is bigger than them combined. Part of that has to do with the fact that games are much more expensive. They cost $60 for the console games, for the hardcore games. But at the same time, this number is growing, and another trend that we're seeing is that digital is growing in expense of what was used to be packaged goods. The other number, we broke a record as an industry. Grand Theft Auto 5 was launched in November, and in 3 days crossed the $1 billion mark. And that made it the fastest growing, selling media product in history. more than any movie, any other franchise you can think of. We're also talking about audience that is becoming more diverse. So the picture that we had in our mind 5, 10 years ago of the 13-year-old sitting in his basement with the pizza playing Halo is no longer. We have 30 years old as an average. We have 47% females, and much has to do with the new platforms, especially Facebook and the smartphones that are bringing a new audience, much more casual. In Facebook, actually, if you look at the numbers, we're talking about, in the US, 55% females. So it's actually a platform that females dominate. And the other competition is the competition on time. And people here from media will tell you that sometimes it's the most important thing, to compete and win the competition on time. This number, 3 billion hours a week, is the number that Jane McGonigal famously cited in her TED Talk. Just to put it in context, 3 years ago, for the first time, online games surpassed email. So people use and play games online more than they use their email. We were approached, just as an anecdote, by AARP, and it was kind of, you know, it was kind of interesting and odd that AARP is coming to Games for Change to think about games. And they were, you know, openly saying that the reason is that 50% of the web traffic on the AARP site are games. Casual games, Bejeweled, Solitaire, etc. So these are the numbers, but, you know, we have sophisticated funders in the room. So you say, well, that's great, it's big, it's huge. Where's the impact? Where's the evidence? So I'm happy to say that we're starting to see, it's still a very young space, 10 years more or less, we're starting to see those early proof points. I'm not going to go deep into the case studies. This is something I'll be happy to share, but we are also trying to refine the categories and not treat impact as one thing that goes into one bucket. We're in a process with the funding, generous funding from the Packard Foundation, to start to try to make this impact typology of how different people use games in different contexts. And one thing that I want to emphasize here, many times we think about good games as educational games and games that are being embedded in the classroom. But a lot of what Games for Change is doing, promoting, and a lot of people in our community are working on games outside of the classroom that is still, you know, they still have great value. One category, communication, the idea of raising awareness, raising funds. Another is civic learning. You'll hear from Jeff about iCivics and that incredible project. Behavior change, health. We see games. Remission is the case study that I'm citing here. Not only that they prove that they can change behavior through video games, they even went on and published those results from sometimes with the most robust evaluation you can think of, randomized trials. They went and published it in medical publications. So it's not something that stays in the gaming industry. The idea of building social capital, collective power, networks, this is the category we're talking about. And the last one is what sometimes people use the dirty word gamification, that has good and bad connotations. We like to call it, to speak about it more in terms of the real usage of the games. It's really to augment an existing program. In the case of Fold It, how many of you heard about the Fold It case? So this is a story that I'll just give you the bottom line because it's pretty incredible. The idea that players in 10 days of playing Fold It, which is a game around folding proteins, okay? Something that contributes to cancer research and HIV/AIDS research. In 10 days, they solved, through this game that was designed not by a game designer, but by a university professor, a problem that the supercomputer couldn't solve in 10 years. And that's a story that if you go and Google it, you'll find it in Time Magazine, in the New York Times, because it became a wide-known story. So these are kind of the categories we look in, and each one of those has those very interesting research reports. And the question that I want to, at least from our perspective, I want to ask today is, are we reaching a tipping point? And when we talk about the tipping point, to Van's introduction, let's look at other media. You know, the idea of using media for good is not new at all. I mean, some of those examples, they live outside the classroom and inside the classroom, in some cases. They are about conveying information. They will make you smarter after you consume them, but you're still engaging and entertaining yourself. And most of all, I love the case of mouse, because it's a case very similar to what we're trying to do. In '92, when Art Spiegelman published Mouse, he won the Pulitzer Prize. He became a bestseller, but he also changed the whole industry. He changed the comic books industry so much that comic books was no longer a good name for it. So now when you go to Barnes & Noble and other bookstores, there is a very nice and serious and with great content, the graphic novel shelf that you can find. You can find great works about political and social issues, biographies, etc. But it's good to say we're at a tipping point. It's great to say that we can use games for good. One thing is to build a marketplace. And many of the people here on the panel are partners with us in doing that. Obviously, the Gates Foundation. And the idea is how you make those things more sophisticated, more sustainable. How do you make sure that things, we learn from each other? How do you make sure that the case studies go out there? And part of the challenge is that the people that make in this community are coming from very different disciplines. If you come to our event, a festival in April that we do every year, and this time we do it with Tribeca, and Craig Atkoff, the co-founder of Tribeca, is here with us. We made this partnership for the first time. But if you come to the festival, you'll see people that come from very different backgrounds, and they speak different languages. Mainly the game creators. They know how to make a game engaging and fun, but they are not the subject matter experts. And for that, they have the people that usually commission the game or partner on the game, like NGOs, foundations, and the people that make the evaluation are also coming from many times from a different discipline. But they need to work together in order to make a great game. Who is funding? This is a really impressive chart, I think. It's not only funding Games for Change, also, although some of those organizations were funding us in the past. First line, government. So you see from the White House to NASA to the NSF, NEA, NEH, Department of Education, universities. These are the universities that not only invest in games, many of them have independent game labs. We're talking about public founders, Gates, MacArthur doing some strategic investments in the field, but also new players, newcomers like Susan Crown Exchange and Knight Foundation and the Packard Foundation, Hewlett Foundation, and corporations. So we have Zynga with us today, one of the biggest gaming companies that for the last, I would say 5 years, is doing a lot of work on how to advance charity and causes through games. And using commercial games that are very successful, from Farmville to Words with Friends and others, to advance those causes. Same time, the challenge is that when we look at it from Games for Change, on one end, it's a happy picture. On the other end, it's how we make sure that it's not a trend and a fashion and something that will go away. How do we make sure that if someone did here a one-time project, it doesn't stay a one-time project, it continues. And you know, in the gaming industry, you have sequels. You know, you have Call of Duty 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There is a reason. It's not only because it's easy. It's because games are complex and games are technology products. And it's much easier to leverage and build on something that is already out there and it's good. And this is what we're trying to do with a lot of those funders. And if I didn't convince you until now that this field is interesting, you have a direct command from the Commander-in-Chief, President Obama. I'm calling for investments in educational software that's as compelling as the best video game.
Okay, our panel is over now.
Let's go and make games. Very quickly, Games for Change. So just that you understand how we look at this as field building. The idea that we can do different things and work with all those stakeholders to advance the field, from convening, we talked about the festival, curation, helping the developers to go out there, to be out there, demo projects like After Sky, to kind of do it on the highest level with the company like Zynga and other partners, and advising. So a lot of people come and say, how do we make the first steps? How it's risky, but we want to play. How do we do it in a way that makes sense? What's next? I think that the Tribeca partnership is really a breakthrough in many senses, not only by taking this field and making it mainstream, but for the first time in April, we're going to have a public event. So until now, our events and our community was all a community of professionals, funders and professionals. For the first time, we're going to be on the streets of Manhattan with a street fair that Tribeca is running every year for 300,000 people, families and kids. And the idea that for the first time, we have developers from our community to be there on the street and interact with the families directly. And the last thing I would say before I'll turn it to Jeff is that my biggest frustration is that we're doing it for 10 years. And if we go out to the street, we'll ask 10 people about the game that Sandra Day O'Connor initiated or other projects, they have no clue. So it's really the transition from building a field to really start to get consumers understand and play those games. Thank you.
Thank you, Asi.
Great. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. As Ben said, I'm the co-founder of iCivics. I would highly recommend those of you that haven't been to Games for Change to please check out that festival. We announced iCivics, Justice O'Connor announced iCivics in 2009 at the Games for Change Festival, and it was just an incredibly powerful venue to launch our program. So I'm excited to talk a little bit more about what iCivics is, and then take some questions a little bit later. But essentially, iCivics is a game-based civics and government curriculum. We develop resources, interactive resources that are all published and available online, align those resources to state and Common Core standards so that teachers throughout the country will have access to really high quality, engaging resources. And one of the first things that we had to figure out was how we were going to get students excited about what is usually a pretty boring topic, civics and government. And we settled early on, thanks to some advice from Jim G., who is a professor at Arizona State University, some of you may be familiar with. We settled on game-based learning, and we did that for a few key reasons. The first is that we felt like civics and government content really lent itself to games, and I think this is a really important consideration for anybody that you're looking to fund in this space. There are certain things that do lend themselves well to games. Not everything lends itself well to games. In our case, we felt like civics was very similar to the gaming process if properly constructed, right? So what do I mean by that? Civics is all about navigating a system to accomplish the goals that you have for yourself or for your community. You're working within this existing infrastructure. And a good game sets up that same dynamic, right? So a good game can inspire inquiry, it can give you immediate feedback, and it can encourage the player to learn more. The other thing that we felt games really did well was personalize the learning experience for the student. So that student that's really excelling in a particular topic, we can deliver more difficult content to, a faster pace to, and that customization was really important for us. The last thing that we felt games really did well was help the teacher who is obviously extremely pressed for time, right? So if we design a really good game, we launch it in browser, we make it as easy to use within the realities of a school or a classroom, that teacher can take it off the shelf and immediately launch into it. And so that ability to use a game with little preparation or on a tight timeline was really important to us, and I think that's been one of the keys to our success as an organization. So how do we go about doing this? We initially partnered with a gaming company in Madison, Wisconsin, Filament Games, and as Asi said, you have to bring a lot of resources to the table to do effective game development. Filament specializes only in educational games. They've been with us as sort of a founding partner. They launched right around the same time that we did, and they've helped us make 19 of our 20 educational games. The way that we partner with them is first around clear learning objectives. So this is one of the most, I think, challenging parts of game design. You really have to anchor a game in a very clear and set of specific learning objectives. Otherwise, your developers may float off into the clouds and make a really cool game that strays completely from what you're trying to accomplish. So that was one of the most important things. The other was to have a set but flexible timeline. So game development is all about iterative process. And the best thing that we've done, I think, as a company is regularly take our games into schools in alpha and beta stages and see what happens. You learn more from a set of 20 students playing your game than you ever will just sitting there jamming with a game developer. So I think being willing to put yourself out there and expose the game as part of the process is a really important key. And then I mentioned this before, but I think since we're sort of a school-based and facilitated learning company, I think it's really important to design within the realities of our schools. So one of the things that we see that's an interesting challenge is a third of our schools are actually on 4-plus-year-old browsers, right? So they have either older hardware or they have really terrible permissions that lock down and don't let them update browsers. So we have to make sure that the games that we put out work within the realities of those schools and those computer labs. And I think that's a really important thing to consider on the front end of any design. So over the 4 years that we've been up, we've created 20 educational games covering all different areas of civics and government. Those games have now been played 15 million times by students around the country. 6 million of those plays actually came last school year, so we're seeing an acceleration of growth and adoption over time. And when we went back and calculated what that roughly 6 million games worked out to be, it was 52 years worth of collective playtime last year from our students. So we're getting a lot of eyes and a lot of time, and I think leveraging that time very effectively in the classroom. iCivics also combines some analog elements to our program, and I think this is an important thing to consider as well. We supplement our games with traditional lesson plans, in part so they work across different school environments, but also so they can draw out the important lessons of the game. We've had research done here from ASU on this, and if a teacher can go back and reinforce with lessons the learning objectives of the game, you get a little more than double the learning outcomes from students. So you can really hone in on the important parts of the game, and I think this reinforces or enforces the learning objectives that the students are drawing from that. So we have hundreds of lessons that are available on our site. These are almost as popular as the game. So we had 1.2 million lessons downloaded from our site last year. So I know we're talking about the future in digital gaming, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there are ways to support and supplement the games that are very important. So all of this for us has combined into quite a significant nationwide impact at scale. We've had 57,000 teachers adopt iCivics. That's roughly half of all public middle school social studies teachers in the US. So we particularly target that grade range, the 6th through 8th grade range, and are happy to report that we have almost half of those teachers in that population using iCivics and registered on our site. Finally, and I think most importantly, we've partnered with, I mentioned ASU, we've also partnered with Baylor and Tufts to do evaluation of our work. And I think these are the set of things that our teachers are asking and our funders are asking for. And we found that games not only help with student motivation, that we're seeing students going and playing games at home unprompted, but they're also leading to a higher level of civic knowledge. And we just did a randomized control trial last year that showed there's significant gains in literacy from the students that are playing our games. So I'm excited to be here, excited to talk more about what is a very rapidly shifting landscape for our schools. And I just wanted to give everyone an overview of iCivics, and I'm excited to now turn this over to Sandra. Thanks so much.
Sandra, before we go to Sandra, I just wanted to ask, is there something in particular you did or you learned about taking your idea from idea to scale? Is there something where you saw your organization's individual tipping point?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't talk about was the product design really needs to be developed in parallel with the distribution strategy. So one of the early decisions we made is to go direct to teacher. We bypassed state DOEs. We tried to make our case directly to the teacher and say, these are games that you can use off the shelf. They're aligned to standards. They meet these clear learning objectives, and they fit within the sequence of what you have to teach. And I think that was one of the key early decisions that we made that helped us get that scale. And they're free.
Good
Thank you.
Excellent
Very good
price
point.
Thanks, Sandra.
Great. Well, thank you. And I encourage you to play iCivics. It's a great game. So I spearhead kids and educational media at WNET. And as Vince said, you may think of us as more traditional broadcasters. But in the world of children's media, we have really spent, I would say, the last 5 years thinking deeply about new media that can engage kids in learning. And I think, our goal is really to give all kids a chance at success and hopefully through our work to have a lasting impact. So I'm going to do a bit of a case study today, but I thought I'd just introduce you to the different audiences we serve and the different content that we tackle. From the youngest audience, we have a new project, Yummy Loo, in development with a great company, Yummy Co., that's looking at how do we use both gaming and narrative to engage kids in healthy habits. And it's really irresistible characters in a food adventure. Oh Noah is actually a video and gaming project as well, designed to introduce kids to language learning. It's a comedic adventure series to introduce kids to Spanish. I'm going to jump to Mission US. Mission US is a series of interactive role-playing games, also for middle school kids, that we launched 3 years ago and has had great penetration in the market. And I think it's interesting because it has no broadcast component whatsoever and serves a slightly older audience than the traditional PBS Kids property, as well as Get the Math. I have to thank Robert because NGLC supported Get the Math, which is a hybrid broadcast and gaming project designed to turn kids on to algebra, a subject that is oftentimes not one that kids embrace and kids struggle with. And we do it by showing real-world applications, people using algebra in jobs such as video game designers or people in sports or chefs, and then through a competition getting kids to play online. But I want to talk a little bit today about a long-standing project, Cyber Chase. And with all of our projects, we start with what's the need and can we actually fill a gap in the marketplace? And clearly, and I think you probably all know this well, there is a need to improve math literacy. And we focus particularly on reaching out to girls and underrepresented populations. And when we developed Cyber Chase, we thought, how can we use all media? I mean, it was interesting. We actually launched it as an online property over a decade ago, but to really directly engage kids in the fun and challenge of math. And from a narrative point of view, the conceit is kind of fun. It's a classic good versus evil story where our kid heroes have to use brain power, not brawn, to save the day and stop the dastardly hacker from his chaos in cyberspace, the hacker. We have live action segments. We try to really make math as friendly as possible. We link it to sports, we link it to invention, all kind of kid-friendly themes. And again, as a public media institution, we really want to reach the broadest audience. So we're focused on free and really reaching a very diverse audience. So we take a really cross-media approach. And I just want to mention that in addition to the gaming, the narrative video, the work we've been doing in mobile, we really go deeply into the communities and form partnerships with schools. We work with Girls Inc., Boys and Girls Club, to take the gaming out of the tablet or out of the screen and also into the hands of kids and educators and parents who we see as allies. So, you know, our approach to gaming, I mean, math is interactive. It is about solving problems, and we really look for natural play patterns. And so the wonderful thing about cyberspace is it's an imaginative story world, and you can go everywhere. And we've really taken advantage of that in the 50 games that we have on our website. We also care deeply about reaching kids at different stages. So our games, we've got single, multi-level, immersive games, open-ended games, and scaffolding and reinforcement is really core to everything we do. We build a lot of supports for parents and teachers so they can integrate these games into the real world. And it's been fun because in the past 2 or 3 years, we've really deepened our commitment to mobile, and it's opened up some interesting partnerships. We're working right now with Teachers College on a research project funded by NSF that's looking at gesture and learning fractions. And I have to say, it was really fascinating. We spent about 6 months watching kids work in the real world with fractions and figuring out, you know, what's a third, what's an eighth, and then thinking about how to translate those real-world gestures into a tablet. And that work continues, but it's pretty exciting. We've also dabbled in augmented reality. We have a new game that launched. It's a free game, Shape Quest, that we'll be demoing later. That introduces kids in, I think, a very fun way to geometry and problem solving. I think, you know, Jeff mentioned it, as did Ozzy, you know, impact is key, and we look at impact in 2 different ways. We certainly look at the metrics, and we watch that carefully and the kind of reach we're having, but I think equally important is the learning impact. And we've really been privileged to have many years of National Science Foundation support, including we launched a 3-year independent study that looked at multiple media and how children actually transfer their learning from one medium to the next. And we've done many other studies, and I won't go into detail, but they can all be found on informalscience.org, which is the NSF website. And then finally, just a quick shout out to what's coming up. This year we've made a commitment to math and nature, and we are launching our first Earth Day special, as well as in the coming weeks we're going to be launching a game making challenge, where we're going to encourage kids to create their own games about the environment and mathematics, and share them with us as part of a national competition. I wouldn't be a good public television producer if I didn't thank the funders. So thank you to a very long list of dedicated funders. We truly wouldn't be here without them and without all of you in the room, our members. And I think what's really fun, CyberChase is a mature project, so we've been out there for about a decade, and you know, we get a lot of fan response on social media, so I couldn't help but share this comment from a 17-year-old. You know, can't credit CyberChase with going into engineering, but certainly I think her love of math, and CyberChase was a little part of that, has launched her into hopefully studying engineering. And I'm just going to put up this slide. I'm not going to dive deeper because of time, but this is the project Mission US that has no broadcast piece to it. Is interactive role-playing games, and I hope if some of you get to stay for the demo, you'll check it out. It really is a great way for kids to become peers from the past and experience social history in a pretty rich way. So, thank you.
You know, I think it's interesting, particularly this last point. You're actually creating there in Mission US a resource that is not a broadcast product. And I think that, in a way, we think of that as really a new way of thinking about public broadcasting and its role. And so I want us to sort of embrace that, the newness of that, but also remember that, and I'm always amazed going back to the original speech that Lyndon Johnson gave in November of 1967, when he announced the creation of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. And so he said, so I think we must consider new ways to build a great network for knowledge, not just a broadcast system, but one that employs every means of sending and storing information that the individual can use. So it took us a few decades, but I think we're actually coming around to seeing the full sort of embrace of the original vision for that. So with that, thank you, Sandra, and let's now hear from our thunder on the panel, Robert Torres.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be here, especially because even though I should be talking here, even though we are we have some level of maturity in this field, and in terms of the products that have been developed and the research that has come out. The tent is still small, and so it's great to be at a place where we might actually, get folks to come in and really join in on what seems to be so far a pretty promising endeavor. So I lead two strategies at the foundation. The primary one being around games and learning, and went to the foundation 4 years ago to lead that strategy. From the Institute of Play. There are lots of great friends and colleagues here. Barbara Orsum has just joined Institute of Play as the executive director. So I want to take us quickly, I'm going to move pretty quickly through a few slides, and this is what I hope to accomplish. Just to give you a sense of why we're in this space, what we fund, and the issue of impact and how we go about measuring that. We are, the reason we're in this space, and I'll get into it more, is particularly to deal with the issue of engagement as well as to make innovations in assessment. And that'll make sense in a little bit. There are 5 design requirements that we ask of designers, and most of our work is around creating R&D labs that are focused on creating embedded assessments within games. We measure impact by the degrees to which games can accelerate learning at a 1.5 times rate. So if you can think of the course of a year, can games actually accelerate a year, half a year beyond that? And there are, lots of complex ways to measure that, but that is a standard measure that we struggle to realize, but that is sort of the goal of the work, and we work with various agencies that try to do that. And then important to the work of the Gates Foundation is that we are about market catalysts. So that we really think about how do we impact on both the supply and demand sides of the market, and strategize strategically and specifically to address both sides. Just a word about how I wound up in games. I, as a teacher, Teach for America teacher, then worked in the leadership of Teach for America, and designed a school and was a principal much earlier than I should have been, and then went on to design schools, and was really fascinated with just the concept of the design of learning environments. How do we design an environment where people learn? And so designed 30 schools here in the city, mostly through funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, when there was that period when the Gates Foundation and Carnegie and Soros, as I'm sure most of you know, were really focused on that. And that work was good, a lot of wonderful, exciting work, and initially it just didn't, the impact that we were seeing was not great. right? How well those schools were faring was just not what we wanted. And we were succumbing. I have a term that we use that we have creating, our ability to create bad schools is in our blood, right? And so, and it's something, and the assessment system was really something that was driving how schools were succumbing to old structures. The other piece there is that this work is, for me, very personal. I grew up very poor in New York City and made a movie following my family for 5 years. And these things are very interconnected as to why I wound up in games, as I hope that becomes clear. I wanted to give just a sense of this slide. I bet most of you know these statistics, but I think we should never forget them. This is why we fund in this space. 95% of 8th graders telling us that they want to go to college, and 8% of low-income kids complete college. And irrelevance cited as one of the main reasons for dropping out of school. And this is what we get daily. And meanwhile, this is also true. And this is significant. The number of kids in this age group, 11 to 18, are spending 13 hours daily. Some of you may be familiar with this report by Kaiser Family Foundation. 50% of youth are internet content creators, and what's interesting about that statistic is that lower income kids are creating just slightly more content than kids in upper SES brackets. And then there's that number of 97% of kids playing video games. I should say too that how I wound up in games too has a lot to do with just wanting to get away from an industry of reform where I could have been happily ever middle class, as is, as many of us are in the reform industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in itself. And realize that, gosh, these kids are just not, we're just not really doing it, even with these small schools. And they were bored, and and schools quickly succumbed to the regents' expectations. And so I realized at one point, gosh, I've learned a lot about teaching, but I haven't learned a lot about learning. And it was a big realization for me. And I said, I need to go and do something different, and went and got a degree in learning sciences. And what we were finding was that it was a time in the early 2000s that we saw that the conditions that actually develop mastery, right, the containers, the insides of the environments that enable mastery are the same conditions that we were seeing video games, right? So when we have a group of 10 players, many of them who are non-science experts, and we're seeing in that game that the science experts do less well than the non-science players, which is fascinating. That we can create these immersive conditions where the remarkable can happen, where kids can apply skill and knowledge to solve a very, very complex problems. And so there's something really rich and deep, and we're not going to have that conversation here, but it is why I am in this space, and it is very profound kind of discovery that we can create these immersive environments where that actually can enable mastery. I wanted to give you a sense of the field. It started in the 70s with Seymour Papert at MIT, asking the question, can games be good for learning? And someone already mentioned James G., who published a book called What Games Can Teach Us About Literacy and learning. And that book really engaged a lot of people, and especially the MacArthur Foundation, which wound up investing $50 million, largely because of Jim G, into field building. And then in the mid-2000s, we realized, gosh, games actually collect tons of data, and we should be thinking about innovating around assessment, which is the engine that drives education in this country. So that's what we are doing. We are doing something pretty unique, which is taking psychometric, top psychometric assessment scientists in the country, and in some instances in the world, and pairing them with game designers. And can we actually create valid assessment measures and embed them into games? And so the psychometric validity question is complex and hairy. The Institute of Play is leading this project, and just 2 weeks ago released an awesome manuscript. Really, it's a book, not a white paper, 160 pages that takes us through the work that they're doing. So we have 5 design requirements, and that is that within games we should be able to assess the application of Common Core and next generation standards, assess complex skills, things that we've been wanting to do but now can actually create measures to do so, embed them into the code of games, and engagement. It is such a remarkable challenge if we ask ourselves, can we make algebra and chemistry as irresistible as Halo? Like, what a great question, right? Like, and in fact, and it's a design issue, and I could think of nothing more exciting, right? How do we do that? How do we actually make this as enticing, and how do we do it so that kids are actually applying what they learn to solve complex, huge problems, like, solving the enzyme of a protein that causes HIV? Immediate feedback and data analytics. So we can now get very granular data on what games can do, and feed it back to kids and teachers. So in terms of, I should say that as happy as we are this year, last year really began the happiness period, because for 9 years we were sort of working out of this hypothesis. Gosh, maybe this might be a good idea. Last year, I took a risk, really, and said my career might end after this study. And we got SRI to do a meta-analysis of we found there were 62,000 studies on games and learning. 77 met the gold standard, and we found these results. And if you Google SRI meta-analysis, related to Glass Lab, because this is all related to the project that we have through Institute of Play. And I keep saying Glass Lab. What I should say is that it is housed at Electronic Arts, one of the largest, if not the largest, one of the largest game development companies in the world. And so we found this, that when kids played games, they did better on cognitive competencies than kids who did not, and they did so by 12% more, right? So their gains were at that much greater, which is remarkable if we think about that, and it gave us a lot of confidence that our hypothesis was okay. I say this, I should say that while there's wonderful pieces of research, this is still an R&D space. We are still exploring. We should not feel confident that we have solved a major problem, or that games are a silver bullet, just like Jeff said. So it is, and we should be treating it that way. And then I'll say this: we, as I said, are really interested in catalyzing markets, and this is also promising. These statistics, that the global growth rate is projected to increase by 8.3%, with the revenues of 2.3 billion. I have to say, I spoke to a group of venture capitalists in September, and I showed this slide, and they got upset. They said if it were only 2.3, we would not be sitting here. And which was great that they said that. And they said what you're not counting is the $8 billion market of the 3 major publishers who are all running to figure out Hugh Mifflin Pearson to how to get into the games space. So a quick snapshot of some of the games that we fund. They're all sort of laboratory kind of designs where game designers are working with assessment scientists and content experts. And that's a wrap.
So I just want to, before we turn to Ken, I want you to be thinking about questions, comments you want to make both in the room and also among those who are watching us on live stream and tweeting. We'll keep an eye on that. Ken? I will also note that Ken, you're Canadian, right?
Mostly Canadian.
And you're a hockey player. So if you note any gloating from Ken, pick that up somewhere. Go on.
Thanks, Vince. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by thanking you, Vince, for your vision and leadership on this category, this newish category of media and media impact. Also like to acknowledge Craig and thank you for partnering with Games for Change, marrying up what some people probably view as a traditional media with this category, and Ozzy for your leadership as well. There are 2 Games for Change board members in the room, Ava and Karen. Thank you guys for your leadership too. I'm the corporate guy, although as Vince alluded to, I come from a social impact background. We're responsible for some traditional CSR at Zynga, but mostly we want to make our lives and our employees' lives interesting by taking risks and investing in innovative projects that can roll up their sleeve and really leverage their own expertise. I'm not going to try to be comprehensive on what we're involved in. I'm just going to try to do a little bit of thought-provoking here. Roshi, is it easy to queue up the video?
Is that better? I have a red light. Yeah. Great.
My name is Sandra. I am a college student. I'm majoring in political science, and I'm minoring in the social justice program here at the University of Portland. I learned about how this guy in the documentary, and I was sort of shocked by, especially the Sierra Leonean episode. My sister-in-law told me that they had developed a game, and I started playing it then, and I invited other people to play it, and I thought it was a really great way to bring this awareness. It's not just a statistic being thrown at you, it's a personal story of someone and their journey with the issues that they face. And even though it's all a game, like, you sort of do have that takeaway experience of feeling like you did experience that community in the first person kind of way. This has definitely opened my mind to the power of gaming and what gaming can do for these issues, because I never really saw the two as connected before when I was studying.
So I just show that video to share with you a reflection when I was considering going to go to Zynga to work about 2.5 years ago. I was skeptical that that person existed. I was being told many anecdotes like this. I was being shown a lot of data, a lot of survey and focus group data by Zynga about how players were engaging, about demographics, about sort of the, the social connectivity of it. And, I was pretty skeptical. But this is one of literally millions of players who we've been able to engage through our games in social impact in a variety of causes. And in this case, this gal had played Half the Sky, something that we collaborated with Games for Change on. So if you need any convincing that that there are millions of people out there like this who are capable of being engaged on this level by games, we just think that that's a good example. Zynga.org exists to answer these limited but ambitious questions. We want to generally show that games can have an impact socially. We want to connect players with causes and great organizations. We're also interested in the ability of games, in particular social games, to make you happier, feel more connected. Some of these are counterintuitive, actually. Can they make you healthier? We have investments in neuroscience and sort of video game or non-pharma interventions and cognitive function, emotional and mental health areas. And of course, we're very interested in the potential of games to improve academic and social outcomes. I'm actually not going to talk about our investments there since so many others have covered that space, but I'm happy to talk about those afterwards. We're also in a group of tech companies in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, and I think in general, questions are being asked about, just how impactful are our products? Are we a good bunch of people? Can we, are we generous? Can we really leverage what we know and what we have, for positive impact? We're trying to answer all those questions. Here are a few ideas just to share with you. I think it's been well established here, but certainly not everybody is aware of how dominant games are as a form of entertainment and leisure. That commercial game companies are perhaps both a detriment in a group of progressive, enlightened people pushing on social causes, but also a potential force for positive impact. And EA and Zynga are a couple of the leaders in that effort. Issue advocacy communications, as well as fundraising and other things that you try to do through other media and other means. There's some pretty compelling ROI to be had within games and on game networks. And lastly, that it's still early and that it's not too late. As Robert said, and as Asi said, it's been a decade or so, but there's still lots of room in the sandbox. I think Games for Change is still open for business on sponsoring content and Street Festival. But in general, and Vince, you alluded to this as well, trend lines, but still a low base, a funding kind of flowing into this category within the space. We've been over some of this in terms of audience size. This was unbelievable and not credible to me when I went to Zynga. Candy Crush, as you all know, is taken over everybody's lives and brains. I think if they wanted to turn that on for simple purposes, it could be done. But more interesting are the more immersive invest and express games like Farmville, which peaked at 40 million players a day across the 3 Farmvilles that now exist. I mean, the numbers are also quite high. I think how people are engaging with games is also important to understand in terms of the sustained nature of the engagement, how it's displacing television, how it's active and not passive. Working with some of our neuroscientists at UCSF, they're now doing MRI imaging of the brain to show you, the difference between consuming other media and consuming games, and how the brain is engaged and what the lasting effects of that are on the brain. This is now a couple of years old. This image on the left was the cover of the Sunday Times Magazine. And we've been trying to imagine the cover on the right as a community. Not sure when they'll revisit that story, but it's clearly both. We are at the same time, while we're mainstreaming the idea of games as an acceptable way to spend some of your time, as a useful tool in advocacy in the classroom, the majority of IP that's out there, the consumable product that's out there, would not necessarily fit our criteria here as funders. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but as EA is doing through Glass Lab, and as we are about to do through our lab, CoLab, licensing game IP, whether it's an entire game being repurposed for educational purposes, or part of a game being licensed, or a sunsetted game being licensed. We recently licensed a game that's no longer live for us to a small company that's making learning games for pre-K special needs kids, and so they got the art and a lot of the the loops, and that's a great use of that asset for us. Network effects. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but obviously there are platforms like Facebook and Android and Steam and Zynga's own platform. There are more traditional platforms, obviously, where there are massive amounts of people collected and reachable, where there are new and interesting dynamics in terms of social connectivity, community efforts, and sort of, as we've seen, particularly after disasters, an ability to kind of accelerate engagement and response very quickly. Zynga just acquired a company called Natural Motion, which comes out of Oxford. They've been around for more than a decade, and they have developed some very interesting underlying technologies which power games like Clumsy Ninja and some racing games, which may not be of interest, but the sort of procedural physics and the kinesiology in these games will become increasingly important in in educational settings as that technology becomes licensable. We're also, as are other game companies, increasingly pushing out our people and giving our people permission to spend their time working on these social impact projects. And we are modestly funding. We've invested $1 million a year, for example, in CoLab with New Schools Venture Fund, which operates the lab with us. As we grow and mature as a company and sort of demonstrate our ability to sustain ourselves, I'm hopeful that we'll become even more generous. Thinking about ROI, I think everybody is sort of at the point where they realize that these types of investments can be compared to traditional methods. They can even be compared to other digital methods. We've been very focused on, are we reaching new audiences? So the demographics playing a lot of Zynga's games are in red states, and in lower education, lower income, lower info geographies. And we've been able to tease out through our profiles, through Facebook IDs, and through surveys, that the majority of players that are engaging with causes and organizations are doing so for the first time. They are also indicating a higher likelihood that they will re-engage after they've made that initial engagement. And so when we see that and working with our nonprofit partners, we're pretty excited. Obviously, the last point, not everything is going to be a smashing success at this point. There's a lot of trial and error, but not unlike the internet in the mid-90s, it's a great, and mostly cheap laboratory compared to producing a television commercial or a direct mail package or a billboard. This is something that we can learn from, fail, and build on fairly quickly. Two examples, Farmville. Anybody playing Farmville or has played Farmville? Good for you guys. Also, you need to ask who's playing a game that isn't a word game that resembles Scrabble. We are closing in on Farmville players having contributed $10 million, about $5 or $6 at a time, to a few dozen different, mostly global NGOs. It's a high proportion of Farmville players that have been engageable and engaged through the game, and sometimes it's as simple as special limited edition virtual items, the proceeds of which go to charity, but sometimes it's more integrated into the game, like a quest or like an element like water. And as I cited earlier, there are definitely some new folks coming on board and folks who are at least self-reporting a higher likelihood to donate. in the future. Robert, I'm not sure if you know about this little experiment, but in our games, which are free to play, if you want to go faster, get to the next level, or get your hands on something special, you have some choices. You can pay, you can wait, you can recruit a crew of friends to help you, or you can watch a short video ad. The completion rates on these ads compared to television and radio and other media is extremely high. You have to show that you've completed the ad to get the reward. And so we ran this classic question about how much of the federal budget do you think goes to foreign aid for a large number of players across our games. Most people got it wrong, predictably. After you answer the question, you got one of 4 50 or so second videos featuring Bill Gates. And the lift in terms of the number of people who got it right after they got it wrong was tremendous. And I won't go into sort of the CPM and the ROI here, but it was, again, relative to other forms of doing this issue advocacy communication, this was a very cost-effective way to reach an audience and to achieve a basic issue advocacy communication objective. I don't have a slide on sort of the role of funders. I didn't want to be too prescriptive, but just in closing, I think it's a great time to ask questions, strategic and program questions, a great time to engage grantees around whether gamification or engagement with some of these game-based strategies might be an accelerant for them and their work. You can certainly seed fund things. You can draw in other funders into experiments, and obviously, there's some field building to support. There's a good core group of funders who've been bold enough to come into the space, but they can't fund it all. And so there are great organizations like Institute for Play, Games for Change, and others who are doing the convening work and doing the, being the glue on projects that demonstrate, this is worth investing in.
So Ken, I wonder if before we leave that slide, you didn't want to go into CPM and ROI and whatever else, but I wonder if I could ask you to do that.
Sure.
Just tease it out a little bit more.
Sure.
I think that's pretty powerful and really interesting.
Yeah. So the math, which I don't have in front of me, it was about a $100,000 investment in the ad inventory, and I believe that we discounted that because we were almost equally interested in the test. I think the ads were served more than 400,000 times, and the completion rate was close to 90%. And you see the lift in sort of going from incorrect to correct. Pretty basic question, pretty easy and cheap to execute on from the Gates Foundation's perspective in terms of Bill sitting for that that video.
Yeah.
Again, relative to he and Melinda going on the road to the capitals of the world to speak to heads of state and finance ministers.
Yeah, because I think it really raises a particularly interesting thing that's probably relevant for some, if not all of you, and that is this notion of engagement. And certainly for, I think, any funder of any topic, you want people to be engaging with the content around your educational content or your environmental messages or what have you. But I think particularly for media funders, and where whether it's journalism or documentary films, there's already a notion that we want more engagement. We're already sort of searching for that. And these outsized outcomes that you're finding, I think maybe it would be interesting to say for any of you, each of you, how do you see games taking engagement further than traditional media? And Ken, if you want to start, because you're into it.
Sure. When I was at the One campaign, we used to have this discussion all the time about, should Bono or Bill write another op-ed, for the New York Times, or should we focus on, Reader's Digest, you could say Today, or a bunch of second-tier city papers. I mean, reaching this audience for 4 or 5 cents, an exposure. acquiring those eyeballs, you know, pretty interesting and also immersive. So the use of video online as the, I think, most popular way of consuming content on the internet. This has increasingly become part of Zynga's approach to advertising, and so I think it's a powerful tool. I mean, in answer to your question, for some categories of games, casino, arcade, you know, the twitchy stuff, I don't know that they hold much promise for you know, as a gateway to true engagement. But the invest and express games, people are, you know, are playing daily. They're playing with people they know. It's important to their lives. You know, having additional meaning layered into the game because they may feel a little bit guilty about spending so much time in the game. But these are long sessions. People have played Farmville, you know, for months and years. The tail on this is not only long, it seems to be interminable. So you're coming back to people in context of their gameplay and in context of the fiction of the game that they're playing. So there's a fidelity that I think is exploitable, for lack of a better term, you know, over a long period of time.
Any other comments on that point?
One aspect that I want to speak about especially in the context of advocacy, and I'm sure that many of us that did projects with any communication know that many times we end up speaking to the same people that are already kind of with us on the issues and educated, and that's the reason that Nicholas Christoph came to Get Your Change with After Sky. So to use this case study, he came with a very simple brief. He said, I want to reach beyond the converted. So, you know, I'm writing for the New York Times, read by hundreds of thousands. He's doing a documentary, which is going to be on PBS, again, a very certain audience. He has a non-fiction book that is not easy to read. It's After Skies is a difficult book to read. And the game, and I think we achieved it with reaching the 1.2 million people with a lot with the distribution power of Zynga, was the idea that we reach people that didn't know anything about After Sky. They're not engaged with the issues. And if you look at the distribution of countries, we actually had in the top 5 countries, Egypt and Turkey and Brazil. So it even surprised us because we assumed the US audience would be most dominant. So I think this whole notion, I mean, games can do great things and they have a lot of positive attributes. But I think also the idea of different audiences that you wouldn't necessarily even reach otherwise.
Sure, I'll add a little. So for those of you who may have not read yet or have heard of Jim's book, he gives 36 reasons why games are incredibly viable tools. You know, that there's, and so I'm like, maybe I'll pick 2 of them. So there's something about games that really enable you to take on an identity and be the architect who's going to solve a particular problem. And that whole process of seeing a world change as you in character as an architect and see the world change based on the decisions that you make and the repercussions of those decisions, the advantages of those decisions, things become suddenly very different. One thing, there was a Danish a set of Danish researchers once who described games as the ability for humans to finally engage with technology that gives them a sense of animus, that games have animus, which is soul, that because you can manipulate things, games actually are these kinds of things that give you a sense of a machine having a soul, which I found really interesting. That other, you know, so you're really in a space where that's happening, and Yeah, I'll just leave it at those two.
Well, let's see if there are questions in the audience. Any comments or questions? Surely, there must be. Heather.
Yeah, this is a great presentation today, and I'm listening and reflecting on the quote
For the live stream.
I work with the WNCODE Foundation on Public Media and Journalism. I also sit on the Philadelphia School Board. And so the comments about bad schools are in our blood really rang true. The tipping point, the 10 is still small. My question is, to what extent, what would it take to see gaming as an integral part of a conventional, traditional school environment, consistently as part of new school? I'm thinking about the fact that even, say, with the tremendous investments that public television has made in early education, we're not making much headway in Ready to Learn, and a substantial headway. So we have demonstrably effective product that if children are in front of it consistently and over some duration, they benefit from it. But it doesn't seem to get to a point where it's really changing the lives of very many people. And so that's my question.
So I may answer quickly on that, Robert, if you want as well. So Quest to Learn is a school that I co-founded. And it's the entire school is using a game-based curriculum. So the innovation there is that every piece of curriculum is co-designed between teachers and designers, game designers. So there's a game designer staff on staff. Games are essentially, a basic structure of games is a set of missions. They're structured on missions and quests, right? So there's a full mission, and then it's divided into a series of quests. And that alone changes the purpose. There's a purpose at the end. There's a boss level that you're trying to beat, so that there is there's artillery and tools. There's reasons why you're learning this particular piece of math, because you're gonna have to use it at some point later in the sequence of these 10-week long missions. And it's very powerful. The boss levels in that school are student-driven, really. Kids are left alone, by and large, for 10 days to solve a very complex problem, where they have to organize themselves and figure out how to use all of the skills to get at the boss level. So those basic structural elements of games have been really useful, and the journey is they're magical and mystical and full of surprise, and the game designers and the teachers really. So it is possible. Meanwhile, at the end, they should be solving something of meaning, right? That has relevance. So there is a white paper of the design that's also a book actually published by MIT Press on the school, and lots of other resources. Do you want to add anything?
Sure. I think whenever this conversation occurs in general, there's also an instant gravitation to technology, right?
Good point.
As the only manifestation of games. But we all grew up playing games, card games, board games, physical games. Okay. Okay, I'm Robert Gahorsam. I'm the executive director of the Institute of Play, and Robert was kind enough to refer to us earlier. So I just wanted to say that the important piece about games and their role in impact and learning and engagement is what goes on in your head when you encounter the space of a game. And whether there's technology involved, whether there's non-digital technology involved, no technology or digital technology involved is almost irrelevant. That's a set of design decisions. So if you take out the challenges of technology into the school, right? Because unlike television or video where there's one standard, one platform, you know what you can deliver, games occur on lots of different things, and there are 4-year-old browsers, behind firewalls. So I'm not saying not to consider technology, because I come out of that world, and that's really where I think the power is. But to answer your question, if you start to look at the issue of games as a design problem and a learning sciences and a cognitive science, all of those issues, there's amazing potential in designing learning experiences and then developing supports for the teachers to do it. So the Institute very quickly has I guess an emerging proof point of that, which is in addition to Glass Lab, which we've been talking about, is we co-run a New York City public school, not that far from here, actually, over on 18th Street called Quest to Learn. It's a middle and upper school. We built out 6th through 10th grade. We have 2 more years to go. And the results, it's designed as Robert has described, and the results are, it's a Department of Ed school. It is a non-selective school. And even after a few years, it gets 6 times as many applicants as there is space. Yes. Come talk to me about that. Can I want to elaborate on what Robert was saying about the boss level, because it's actually turning out to be one of the most impressive learning experience I've ever seen, beyond just the ties to curriculum and discipline. So in December, I was a judge, one of the semi-outside judges on the 6th grade boss level, which was Rube Goldberg machines. So this was actually not 10 days, it was 1 week. Kids had to conceive, design, manufacture, test, rehearse, and present their machine to a group of adult judges. So not only was there physics to learn, there was teamwork, there was planning, there was design. Each machine had to have a narrative. So the winning design, by the way, was a Rube Goldberg machine about a third the size of this room, right? Occupied a full classroom volume. That dropped a piece of trash into a waste basket, and the theme was New York City. So there were tunnels and bridges and buildings. 6th graders did this in 5 days. For that particular one, there's a website for the school, and we're just uploading the videos now. So I hope that gives you some idea of what's possible with game thinking.
Any other questions? Because I know maybe you're holding your questions, you're holding your tongue, because you know that as soon as we stop, we'll go play. Was there a question?
I was just going to add one comment. I'm sorry. Is there another question?
Do you have a question?
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I thought you.
I just wanted to speak to your comment, because I think there is a reality of, teachers' time and testing. And so those, unfortunately are barriers. And I think one of the things Jeff said is, there's a mindset, absolutely, in terms of embracing the fundamentals of games, but I think there's also some core support that is needed, because we found a keen difference if we put a game out there that we really support with very rich resources and think about it, being very adaptable in different formats, very flexible in the classroom, as opposed to being too prescriptive. And then, if possible, designing ways to support teachers. And, certainly that's difficult to do nationally face-to-face, but through technology, presenting some snapshots of games actually being played in the classroom that, become models for others to look at. So I think there are barriers, but there are creative ways to start to, move beyond them. So.
Yeah, question?
I'm Diane Levitt, and I'm from Cornell Tech. And my question is anybody working on games that actually teach in the play pattern coding or the writing of games, so that there's some iterative opportunity for kids and for us to use this as a tool to embed computational thinking and computing in their lives?
Yes.
Answer's yes.
There are several. I did my dissertation on one of those games and was on the design team of one called GameStar Mechanic, which also launched at the Institute of Play and is now managed by a company called Eline. But there are a number of them, games that are designed around teaching you how to be a game designer. What are the names of the other ones? Game Maker. What's the Microsoft one? Kodo.
Yeah. We've in our collab, which is our EdTech product accelerator. We've just graduated the first cohort of 6 companies. We've just we're about to announce the second cohort, and in each we had 65 applicants for the second cohort, and a number of them, maybe 3 or 4 were games that teach, that enable you to build games. A couple of them were WYSIWYG, so not a lot of coding, but some of them were actually quite expected quite a lot of the kids in terms of giving them, these coding tools and helping them to build, fairly complex characters and games. Yeah.
One comment maybe. The other, there is, we tend to compare games to other media, and we did it also here in several presentations, but there are huge differences, and some of them are very distinct. And one of them is that at the heart of games, it's not necessarily the story or this linear, beginning, middle, and end script that you go through. There is a system, and the system has rules. And for every game, from the most simple Pac-Man to the most robust console game, someone designed this system very carefully. Sometimes he made it a very loose system. Sometimes he made it a very tight system. So you're almost like he always knows where you go. And when kids are making those games through those tools, it gets into a creative process that is very different than writing something linear. They need to dive in and in a very deep way understand a system in order to construct it, and usually in a simplified, simulated way.
That's a good point. And there's another effort that I saw that Mozilla Foundation was on the list. Is Leah Gilliam in the room? But in any event, if she's not, they're working on something called the Open Badges process, which if you're not familiar with that, that's another place where people are getting skills, and there's a lot of educational implications for this, but getting skills and badges, kind of like the Scout badges, things like that for these skills. We've got other expertise in the room, the Educational Software Association, right? Entertainment Software.
Yes, hi, I'm Jenny from the Entertainment Software Association Foundation. So we are actually funding a project called Bootstrap, which teaches 5th graders how to learn algebra using a kind of a coding system. So they get a taste of how to create a game, but also teaches them algebra as well, and it's been quite successful. So my question is that, I'm very excited to see, looking through the list of participants, so many different foundations here that I have not seen before. When our foundation started about 14 years ago, this topic really did not exist. And we were kind of looking for projects to sponsor in this space. I am curious to see, other than the folks that I see over and over again, how many other foundations in this room are currently sponsoring projects in the game technology space. So we have 2. That's 3. That's really exciting. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's a great secret, right? But I'm really thrilled to see that. But we do as well.
Needs. Our gift is for the development of the curriculum projects that he mentioned, which, while not the games themselves, are still important in the implementation, and a place where other small funders can certainly get involved.
We're next to you, but it was
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Silvina from Synergos. I have a question. I'm not sure. There were 3 comments that made me think about this. I work in the international arena, and as you mentioned that the game Half the Sky, you were interested in how you had a lot more uptake in other countries. Ken, you mentioned you had a slide about projected growth, and I noticed that the largest was Latin America. And Robert also mentioned that we shouldn't think necessarily always about games and technology, and which is something that when you think in the most traditional way about international development, you think, oh, well, somebody in Sudan is not going to have a console. So I don't necessarily have a particular question, but I would love it if anybody has a comment in how your industry relates to the traditional international aid, international development, and international spectrum. Thank you.
I think in part the reason that there was so much uptake internationally was that we promoted it on the through Zynga channels alongside the latest Farmville expansion and the latest Cityville expansion. So the majority of our audience is actually not American, and so they were responding to that invitation to to play that game. We have a global view of games on the commercial side. We have we are of course interested in helping with the Common Core kind of rollout, and we're coaching game designers on how to have hooks and how to be aligned with Common Core. But I think a lot of the content in collab and a lot of the learnings that our companies are sharing with one another are sort of universal in their application. In terms of international development, when we survey our players, it doesn't rank very highly in terms of the causes that they want to see in their games. So we respect that and give them, kids with cancer and cute animals that need to be saved. But we have an opinion too, and we are finding ways to introduce those causes and organizations into games opportunistically as well.
Okay. Well, I think we could take more questions and eat into our game time, but I don't want to do that. So, you want to make another comment? That's fine. That's fine. Sure.
I just wanted to give a shout out to someone who's in the room who has really been instrumental, and that's Eric Huey, who in creating the enabling conditions for this field, like ESA. What is your title? Vice President. Senior Vice President, and a lot of advocacy and policy work behind the scenes. We have at the White House now a second term of someone whose role is just to inform the White House on gaming, on games learning, which is really remarkable. And so anyway, important.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. I try to do that myself, and so. Any help, I will take the help. We've got great expertise and really fascinating people in the room. We want to give you an opportunity to meet each other further and to dive into these games a little bit. I'll just offer just a few quick reminders. The 11th Annual Games for Change Festival happens April 22nd through 24, and in conjunction with the Tribeca Film Festival. That's very exciting new conditions coming up. Our own event next week on March 5th at the Annenberg Space for Photography in Los Angeles and everywhere in the world on the live stream is happening. We're going to have all of the content that we're delivering is going to be available on the live stream, and join us for that on March 5th. Further information at mediaimpactfunders.org. And right now we're going to have opportunities to experience the games from Games for Change, iCivics, and WNET just out here in the reception space and next door in the small conference room. And apart from that, thank you to Ronna Brown and her team here, especially Roche Amelia at Philanthropy New York. Thank you all for joining us here in the room and on the live stream. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Like for a year, and my 1.5 year like around 5:30. You're like,
have you done broadcasting or
Really? Just a lot of
That's why you knew me after. That's very
right.
funny.
I mean, I cook while it's on, so I know everything there is to know. So I don't know what kind of recognition Christopher Williams got. I'm excited about it. But it's actually a super robust, highly complex film.
And